Meet Syokimau, the prophetess who predicted colonization in Kenya before it happened. Before the British landed in Kenya in the 1800s, a young medicine woman in the present-day town of Machakos had predicted their arrival. Her name was Syokimau. Legend has it that she had sprung out of a tree, as not anyone knew of her parents or close relatives. People wondered if she was sent from heaven or if she was the chosen one. Today we're taking you back to Kenya in the 18th century to the reign of the great prophetess. Syokimau and the prophecy. The Kamba people believed that her ability to prophesy came when she was attacked by a maimo, a benevolent spirit, when she was just a young girl. With her gift, she was able to predict attacks from neighboring communities, the Kikuyu and the Maasai. The Akamba warriors listened to her and prepared for the battle well in advance, increasing their chances of victory against the community. She also had the ability to prophesy which community will win a war. She conducted prayers for the warriors under a designated tree that acted as a shrine called Ithembo, where she would also make sacrifices for the warriors to come home unhurt. Mwatu Wangoma, then the leader of the community, heeded her counsel before battle and when he was facing a challenge in ruling over the people. It was not long before Syokimau predicted the coming of the British. Her prophecy indicated the arrival of a long snake producing fire and smoke, and in it were people with skin like meat, who spoke unintelligibly like birds and carried fire in their pockets. She also predicted colonization, telling the Akamba people that the people with funny skin will beat them mercilessly and take over their land. She also added that the Europeans will also force the natives to discard their gods and worship their British God. Prophecy confirmation. The prophecy of Syokimau came to pass in 1844 when the Europeans led by German missionaries Johannes Rebmann and Johann Ludwig Krapf arrived in Kenya's interior to spread the gospel. In 1895, the British Empire established the East African Protectorate, known as the Kenya Colony. In 1920, the report of cruelty and killing of native Kenyans by the British colonizers was just what Syokimau had predicted. The snake in the prophecy referred to the Lunatic Express, the Kenya-Uganda Railway, which was constructed in 1896. Just like she lived, Syokimau had an interesting death. One random morning, the villagers of Iveti, where she used to stay, found her dead in her hut. As per traditions, they disposed of her body in the forest after waiting 2 days to confirm that she was really dead. British colonial rule in Kenya. The British East African Company was granted a charter in 1888, which led to the colonization of present-day Kenya. When the company became bankrupt, the British government took over administration of the colony, which they intended to use as a gateway to Uganda, Buganda, and Bunyoro because there were no minerals to exploit in Kenya. In order to subdue the colony, the British authorities forcibly took land, introduced forced labor, and passed legislation that ensured natives became subjects of the British settlers. The road to colonization of Kenya was difficult for the British because by the turn of the 20th century, Indians outnumbered whites 2-1, and the Indian rupee was Kenya's main currency. It is reported that there were approximately 23,000 Indians and only 10,000 whites. As a means of consolidating power, the British introduced the herd tax in 1902. A certain amount of taxes was to be paid to the government for each herd a family owned. This meant that native Kenyans had to earn money, which could only be achieved by working for someone else that could pay those wages. The punishment for not paying a herd tax was a fine, and which often, when not paid, led to forced labor, thereby providing the British settlers with the cheap labor they were searching for. As demand for labor increased, British settlers then introduced poll tax, which was required for every citizen in the country. In addition, Kenyans had to work 60 days of a year for the government unless they were already employed by British settlers. This led to the creation of native reservations, which were often situated far from major roads and rail, and whose soil was not conducive for farming. A lot of measures employed by the British settlers in Kenya were imported from South Africa and southern Rhodesia, or Zimbabwe today. In 1913, the government passed a land bill that gave the white British settlers 999-year leases on the land and effectively created a monopoly on land use. Later in 1919, British settlers introduced the Kipande system that required all Kenyan men to wear identity discs similar to the Chitupa introduced in southern Rhodesia, which limited movement of laborers. The Colony and Protectorate of Kenya was established on 11th June 1920, when the territories of the former East African Protectorate, except those parts of the Protectorate over which His Majesty the Sultan of Zanzibar had sovereignty, were annexed by the UK. The Kenya Protectorate was established on 13 August 1920, when the territories of the former East African Protectorate, which were not annexed by the UK, were established as British Protectorate. The Protectorate of Kenya was governed as part of the Colony of Kenya by virtue of an agreement between the UK and the Sultan, dated 14 December 1895. In the 1920s, natives objected to the reservation of the White Highlands for Europeans, especially British war veterans. Bitterness grew between the natives and the Europeans. The population in 1921 was estimated at 2,376,000, of whom 9,651 were Europeans, 22,822 Indians, and 10,102 Arabs. Mombasa, the largest city in 1921, had a population of 32,000 at the time. Native Kenyan laborers were in one of the three categories: squatter, contract, or casual. By the end of World War I, squatters had become well established on European farms and plantations in Kenya, with Kikuyu squatters comprising the majority of agricultural workers on settler plantations. An unintended consequence of colonial rule, the squatters were targeted from 1918 onwards by a series of resident native laborers' ordinances, criticized by at least some MPs, which progressively curtailed squatter rights and subordinated native Kenyan farming to that of the settlers. The Ordinance of 1939 finally eliminated squatters' remaining tenancy rights and permitted settlers to demand 270 days' labor from any squatters on their land. And after World War II, the situation for squatters deteriorated rapidly, a situation the squatters resisted fiercely. In the early 1920s, though, despite the presence of 100,000 squatters and tens of thousands more wage laborers, there was still not enough native Kenyan labor available to satisfy the settlers' needs. The colonial government duly tightened the measures to force more Kenyans to become low-paid wage laborers on settler farms. The colonial government used the measures brought in as part of its land expropriation and labor encouragement efforts to craft the third plank of its growth strategy for its settler economy, subordinating African farming to that of the Europeans. Nairobi also assisted the settlers with rail and road networks, subsidies on freight charges, agricultural and veterinary services, and credit and loan facilities. The near total neglect of native farming during the first 2 decades of European settlement was noted by the East Africa Commission. The resentment of colonial rule would not have been decreased by the wanting of provision of medical services for native Kenyans, nor by the fact that in 1923, for example, the maximum amount that could be considered to have been spent on services provided exclusively for the benefit of native population was slightly over 1/4 of the taxes paid by them. The tax burden on Europeans in the early 1920s, meanwhile, was very light. Interwar infrastructure development was also largely paid for by the indigenous population. Kenyan employees were often poorly treated by the European employers, with some settlers arguing that native Kenyans were like children and should be treated as such. Some settlers flogged their servants for petty offenses. To make matters even worse, native Kenyan workers were poorly served by colonial labor legislation and a prejudiced legal system. The vast majority of Kenyan employees' violations of labor legislations were settled with rough justice meted out by their employers. Most colonial magistrates appear to have been unconcerned by the illegal practice of settler-administered flogging. Indeed, during the 1920s, flogging was the magisterial punishment of choice for native Kenyan convicts. The principle of punitive sanctions against workers was not removed from the Kenyan labor statutes until the 1950s. The effect of British colonial rule till date. To begin with, Kenya's economy has a narrow base. It is not adequately diversified. It relies on a few primary commodities, including coffee, tea, pyrethrum, and flowers for foreign exchange. As a consequence, Kenya's economy lacks the desired autodynamism. This is primarily due to also the economy's external linkage, which places it at the mercy of fluctuations in world prices. The third colonial economic heritage includes the monopolistic and imperfect nature of the market. Despite the country's pursuit of structural adjustment programs since the 80s, the Kenyan state continues to exercise control over the market through price regulation. As happened during the colonial era, the market continues to serve as an instrument of political control and exploitation. Furthermore, Kenya's economy continues to be technologically, financially, commercially, and monetarily dependent on Britain and other European countries, the United States of America, Japan, and increasingly China. Since the advent of political independence, Kenya has successfully diversified the range of countries on which she is dependent for foreign aid. The consequence of this has been the deterioration in the country's balance of payments. Moreover, income inequality and poverty have become more prevalent since independence. Colonialism had its own share in the country's inequality and poverty as it promoted rural, urban, regional, and class differences in development. As a consequence, the contraindications that characterize colonial Kenya have been accentuated. These include contradictions in the social relations of production between the international and domestic bourgeoisie, between the peasantries and the bourgeois, and between capital and labor. Like the colonial state, the post-colonial state has had to cope with these series of contradictions. The local bourgeoisie habitually resort to high-level corruption to accumulate wealth and power. They also invoke racial and ethnic sentiments to stay in power. Superintending class and ethnic politics is the president and the political elite around him. Like we said at the beginning of this video, Syokimau had an interesting life and an interesting death. Local villagers disposed of her body after 2 days. The second day after they had disposed her body, an interesting phenomenon happened. A crying voice could be heard in the forest, leading the villagers straight to where they had placed her body. And there was Syokimau. She was praying and shouting, and once she glanced at the baffled neighbors, she cried out that it was really her. Oral literature has it that Syokimau lived for more 2 seasons before dying and resurrecting again, this time as an old woman appearing before young girls who had gone to collect firewood. She went back to her hut and even talked to a few people who had come to see her. She was found the next morning dead, but this time for real. She had died with her mouth open and facing upwards, what people believed was the posture she had when she was speaking to the ancestors. Syokimau is a legend not only for the Kamba community but for Kenya as a country. A township a few kilometers from Nairobi is named after her. A prophetess from the area, Syongu, who was impressed by the works of Syokimau, decided to name a village in her territory after the great prophetess. She has also been honored by the Kenyan government, which named one of its train stations after her. In the station is a statue of Syokimau in her greatness. Are such people still considered a blessing in Africa? Leave us your thoughts in the comments section, and do not forget to subscribe to this channel for more educative and entertaining videos. Make sure to like and share with your friends.